Hello, and welcome to The Human Legacy, the podcast where we trace the grand story of civilization. I'm your host, Alexa.
And I'm Sam. Today, we're embarking on a truly epic journey. We're beginning a multi-part series based on one of the greatest works of history ever written, Will Durant's The Story of Civilization.
And our focus for this series is a period often misunderstood, often simplified, and absolutely foundational to our modern world. We're talking about the Middle Ages, or as Durant calls it, the Age of Faith. This isn't just about knights and castles. It's about the collapse of a world order and the painfully slow, creative, and often violent birth of a new one.
That's right. We're going to span over 1,000 years of history, from the slow death of the Roman Empire in the West to the dazzling dawn of the Italian Renaissance. And we won't just be in Europe. We'll travel to the glittering capital of Byzantium, the vibrant cities of the Islamic Caliphate, and the scattered scholarly centers of the Jewish diaspora. This is a global story.
Our central theme is the evolution, transformation, and dramatic interaction of these major civilizations. We'll see how religion, Christianity, Islam, Judaism wasn't just the private belief, but the very engine of society, shaping politics, law, art, and daily life.
We'll ask big questions. Why did Rome really fall? How did a tiny faith from Palestine conquer an empire? How did Islamic scholars save the knowledge of the ancient world? And was the Renaissance a sudden rebirth, or was it the natural flowering of seeds planted centuries earlier in the so-called Dark Ages?
So, whether you're a history student, a curious mind, or just someone who wants to understand how the world we live in came to be, this series is for you. You're going to come away with a deep appreciation for the complex, intertwined, and astonishingly rich legacy of this age.
Let's begin at the end of an era, the 4th century. The Roman Empire is Christian, but the old pagan world is not yet dead, and one man, an emperor, will make a last desperate attempt to turn back the tide. Part 1, The Last Pagan, Julian the Apostate.
So let's set the scene. It's the mid-4th century. Constantine the Great has legalized Christianity, and by the end of the century, it will be the official state religion of the Roman Empire. The old gods, Jupiter, Apollo, Venus, are being pushed to the margins, but they're not gone. And into this moment of upheaval steps a fascinating, almost tragic figure, Emperor Julian, known to history as Julian the Apostate.
Julian is a fascinating study in contradictions. He was raised a Christian, but he secretly fell in love with the philosophy and culture of the old pagan world. When he became emperor in 361 AD, he shocked the empire by openly rejecting Christianity and trying to restore a reformed, philosophical paganism as the state religion.
This wasn't just about bringing back animal sacrifices, was it? He had a more sophisticated plan.
Absolutely. He was a Neoplatonist philosopher. He wanted to create a pagan church that could compete with Christianity. He established a hierarchy of pagan priests, modeled on the Christian clergy. He emphasized charity and moral virtue, something the old Roman state cults hadn't really focused on. He even tried to rebuild the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, a move many saw as a direct challenge to Christianity's claim to be the new Israel.
But why did he fail? If he was the emperor with all that power, why couldn't he stop Christianity?
It's a great question, and it tells us a lot about the state of the empire. First, Christianity was no longer a fringe sect. It was deeply entrenched in the urban population and the state bureaucracy. Second, his reforms were too little, too late. The old pagan religions were deeply local and traditional. They weren't suited to being organized into a unified, dogmatic church like Christianity. And third, his reign was incredibly short. He ruled for only about 20 months.
And his death was almost symbolic. He died on a campaign against the Persians, struck by a spear. The legend, spread by Christian historians like Durant, was that his last words were, "You have won, Galilean," conceding defeat to Christ.
Whether he actually said that is doubtful, but the sentiment was correct. His death marked the definitive end of any serious attempt to restore paganism in the Roman Empire. The tide was irreversible. The age of the classical gods was over. The age of faith had begun. And his failure showed that the real battle was no longer between Christianity and paganism, but within Christianity itself over what this new state religion would actually believe.
So, with the religious question settled, at least in terms of which god would be worshipped, the empire should have stabilized, right? But instead, just over a century after Julian's death, the Western Roman Empire ceases to exist. What happened? If it wasn't the gods punishing them, what caused the fall of Rome?
The fall of Rome, a death by 1,000 cuts. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? For centuries, people have pointed to the barbarian invasions as the simple cause. But as Durant and modern historians argue, it was so much more complex. It was a slow-motion collapse caused by a perfect storm of internal failures.
Let's break down these internal failures. What was rotting the empire from within?
First and foremost, political instability. The 3rd century was a nightmare of civil war. In a 50-year period, there were over 20 emperors, most of them assassinated by their own troops. The army became the real power, and emperors were less about governing and more about surviving. This constant infighting bled the empire dry and left its borders vulnerable.
And that leads directly to the second point, economic collapse. How do you pay for all these civil wars and a massive, bloated army?
Exactly. The state's solution was to devalue its currency. They reduced the silver content in coins so much that they triggered hyperinflation. At the same time, taxes on the middle class and small farmers became crushing. To escape this burden, many free farmers essentially sold themselves into a form of serfdom to wealthy landowners who could protect them. This is a key root of the feudal system that would follow.
So you have a shrinking tax base, a devalued currency, and a massive military budget. It's a death spiral. Then add in the plagues. The Antonine Plague and the Plague of Cyprian in the 2nd and 3rd centuries killed millions, devastating the population and the economy.
Precisely. And all of this created a profound social and moral decay. There's a famous quote from the historian Cassius Dio writing about the reign of Emperor Commodus, where he says, "Our history now descends from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust." There was a widespread sense that the world was growing old, that the Great Age was over. This loss of confidence is hard to measure, but it's crucial.
So the empire is a hollowed-out shell. Now let's talk about the so-called barbarians. Who were they, and what did they actually want?
This is a key misconception. The barbarians weren't mindless hordes. They were often sophisticated Germanic peoples like the Goths, Vandals, and Franks. Many had been living on the borders for generations, serving in the Roman army. They weren't trying to destroy Rome. They wanted in. They wanted the security, the wealth, the land.
A great example is the Visigoths. They were actually fleeing the terrifying Huns and asked the Roman Empire for sanctuary.
Right. And the Roman officials, corrupt and incompetent, exploited them, selling them food at outrageous prices. This led to a rebellion, and at the Battle of Adrianople in 378, the Visigoths annihilated the Roman army and killed the Eastern Emperor Valens. This was a seismic event. It proved that Roman legions could be defeated on home soil.
From there, it was a slow unraveling. Alaric the Visigoth sacks Rome itself in 410. The Vandals sweep through Gaul and Spain and set up a kingdom in North Africa, cutting off Rome's grain supply. And finally, in 476, the German general Odoacer simply deposed the last boy emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, saying the West no longer needed an emperor.
And here's the most important takeaway for our daily lives. For the vast majority of people, life went on. The Roman landlord was often replaced by a Germanic chieftain, but the peasants still farmed the same land. The real change was the collapse of large-scale systems, long-distance trade, a unified currency, a centralized state that could maintain infrastructure and law. The world became smaller, poorer, and more local. The light of a unified Mediterranean civilization in the West had gone out.
But in that darkness, one institution not only survived, but grew stronger, becoming the sole repository of learning, order, and hope, the Christian Church. How did a persecuted sect transform into the administrative and cultural backbone of Europe?
Part 3. The Unconquered Church, Forging Europe. The church was perfectly positioned to fill the vacuum left by the collapsed state. It had a superb administrative structure mirroring the Roman Empire itself, with its dioceses and bishops in every major city. It had a dedicated, literate clergy, and most importantly, it had a message of hope and order in a world descending into chaos.
But it wasn't a smooth process. The church was constantly tearing itself apart over doctrine. We hear about these early heresies, Arianism, Donatism, Nestorianism. What were these fights really about, and why did they matter so much?
They mattered because in an age of faith, getting theology right was seen as essential for salvation and for the stability of the universe. Arianism, for example, argued that Jesus, the Son, was a created being and therefore not co-eternal or equal to God the Father. This wasn't just academic, it struck at the heart of the Christian concept of God.
And the church responded with councils like the Council of Nicaea in 325, which produced the Nicene Creed that many Christians still recite today, affirming that the Son is begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father.
Exactly. These councils were like the intellectual and constitutional conventions of the new civilization. They were defining the rules, and towering figures emerged to defend and shape this orthodoxy. You had Saint Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate, which became the standard for 1,000 years. You had Saint Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, who famously confronted Emperor Theodosius and denied him communion after a massacre, establishing the principle that the church had moral authority over the state.
And then you had the giant, Saint Augustine of Hippo. His book, The City of God, was a direct response to the sack of Rome in 410. Pagans were blaming the Christians, saying they had abandoned the old gods and brought this disaster. How did Augustine answer them?
He made a profound philosophical argument. He said there are two cities, the earthly city, built on love of self, and the city of God, built on love of God. The fall of Rome was merely the failure of an earthly city, which is always temporary and flawed. The true home for Christians is the eternal city of God. This provided a theological framework for enduring the collapse of civilization itself. It was a Copernican revolution in perspective.
And alongside the bishops and theologians, you had the rise of the monks. Monasticism became a massive social force.
It did. Figures like Saint Benedict, who wrote his rule in the 6th century, created ordered communities of prayer and work. Monasteries became islands of stability, preserving ancient manuscripts, developing new agricultural techniques, and providing charity. They were the frontier outposts of civilization, converting the pagan countryside and preserving literacy and learning through the darkest years.
So by the time the last Western emperor is gone, the church is the only institution standing. It has a bureaucracy, a defined doctrine, a powerful intellectual tradition, and a network of monasteries. It's ready to begin the long, slow work of building a new world from the ashes of the old. But while the West was falling apart, the Roman Empire in the East, what we call the Byzantine Empire, was not only surviving but thriving. Its capital, Constantinople, was the greatest city in the world.
Part 4. The Glittering Kingdom, Byzantium and Justinian.
Absolutely. We have to shake off the idea that the Roman Empire fell in 476. It continued for another 1,000 years in the East. Constantinople, sitting at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, was a megalopolis of 1 million people when London and Paris were muddy towns of a few thousand.
And the figure who best embodies the ambition and splendor of this Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire is the Emperor Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565. His reign was a massive and ultimately exhausting attempt to reconquer the lost Western provinces.
Yes, his brilliant general, Belisarius, did indeed recapture North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and parts of Spain. For a brief moment, the Mediterranean was once again a Roman lake. But these wars were incredibly costly and left the empire overextended and vulnerable to new threats, like the Persians in the east and the Slavs and Avars in the Balkans.
But Justinian's most enduring legacy isn't his military campaigns, it's his law code.
The Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. This was a monumental achievement. Justinian's lawyers codified centuries of Roman law, pruning contradictions and creating a coherent, systematic legal text. This code preserved Roman legal principles, ideas like innocent until proven guilty, and the importance of intent in crime, which would become the foundation of nearly every European legal system centuries later. It was a gift of Rome to the future.
And then there's the art and architecture. If there's one building that defines Byzantium, it's the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom.
Justinian rebuilt it after a riot destroyed the previous church. And when he walked in for the first time, he supposedly exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." And he was right. The dome of the Hagia Sophia seemed to float on a halo of light from its windows. The interior was covered in acres of gold mosaic, glittering in the light from countless lamps. It was designed to create a sense of heaven on earth, a physical manifestation of the Byzantine ideal where the emperor was God's representative on earth and the church and state were two sides of the same coin.
This idea, this fusion of spiritual and political power is called Caesaropapism, right? The emperor was both Caesar and Pope.
Exactly. This was a key difference between East and West. In the West, after the empire collapsed, the Pope often had to act independently of secular power. But in Byzantium, the emperor controlled the church. He appointed the Patriarch of Constantinople and saw himself as the guardian of orthodoxy. This created a more unified but also more rigid society.
And this rigidity would have consequences. While Justinian was trying to restore Rome's glory in the West and enforce religious unity at home, a new force was gathering strength in the deserts of Arabia, a force that would shatter the ancient world order forever and create a civilization that would rival both Rome and Persia. Part 5. The Desert Prophet, the Rise of Islam.
To understand the rise of Islam, we first need to look at its context. The two great powers of the region, Byzantium and Sassanid Persia, had just fought a series of utterly exhausting wars against each other. They were like two prize fighters who had beaten each other senseless, leaning on each other, unable to stand. They were financially and militarily drained.
And sandwiched between them was Arabia, a vast peninsula of warring tribes with no central authority, but with a vibrant oral poetic tradition and a mix of paganism, Judaism, and Christianity. Into this world, in the trading city of Mecca, around 570 AD, last prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born.
At the age of 40, while meditating in a cave, he received the first of a series of revelations from the angel Gabriel. These revelations, which he believed were the words of the one God, Allah, would later be compiled into the Quran. His message was a powerful call to abandon idolatry and submit to the one merciful, all-powerful God.
But this wasn't just a spiritual message, was it? It was a social and political one, too.
Profoundly so. It emphasized social justice, care for the poor and orphaned, and the creation of a unified community of believers, the Ummah, that transcended tribal loyalties. This was revolutionary in a society torn apart by tribal feuds. Unsurprisingly, the Mecca establishment resisted this message.
This led to the Hijra, the migration to the city of Yathrib, later renamed Medina in 622 AD. This event marks the year 1 of the Islamic calendar. Muhammad, peace be upon him, the great last prophet, he was a lawgiver, a statesman, and a military leader.
He unified the tribes of Medina under the Constitution of Medina, and after a series of battles with Mecca, he eventually returned in triumph in 630, cleansing the Kaaba of its idols and dedicating it to the worship of the one God, Allah. By the time of his death in 632, most of Arabia had united under the banner of Islam.
And then the explosion. Under the first caliphs, the rightly guided ones, the Islamic armies burst out of Arabia. They swiftly conquered the Byzantine provinces of Syria and Egypt, and then completely overran the exhausted Sassanid Persian Empire. It was one of the most rapid and dramatic military expansions in history.
Why were they so successful? First, the Byzantine and Persian empires were weakened. Second, the Arab armies were highly motivated by faith and the promise of paradise if they fell in battle. Third, they were often welcomed by the local populations in Syria and Egypt, who were Monophysite Christians and had been persecuted as heretics by the Orthodox Byzantines. The Muslim rulers offered them more religious tolerance in exchange for a special tax.
So in less than a century, Islam went from the revelation to a single man in a desert cave to the ruling faith of an empire stretching from the borders of India to the Pyrenees in Spain. And at the heart of this new civilization was its sacred text, the Quran. Part 6. The Word and the World, the Quran and Islamic Civilization.
But Quran is not just a holy book to be recited. It's the literal, uncreated word of God for Muslims. It's the central miracle of Islam. Its structure is not chronological, but roughly by length of chapters or surahs. Its language, classical Arabic, is considered inherently sacred and untranslatable in a liturgical context.
And its content is vast. It's not just spiritual teachings, it's a comprehensive guide to life. It contains stories of prophets familiar to Jews and Christians, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, whom it sees as predecessors to Muhammad, and it provides detailed laws on everything from marriage and inheritance to crime and governance.
This fusion of the spiritual and the legal is key. There is no separation of church and state in classical Islamic thought. The Sharia, or Islamic law, derived from the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet, is meant to govern all aspects of life. This created a powerful, unified social framework for the diverse peoples they now ruled.
And this framework allowed for an astonishing flourishing of culture and science, what we now call the Islamic Golden Age, particularly under the Abbasid Caliphate, which built its new capital at Baghdad in the 8th century.
This is a critical chapter in the story of human knowledge. The caliphs in Baghdad actively sought out the knowledge of the world. They sponsored a massive translation movement, gathering Greek texts on philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy from the Byzantine Empire and the former Persian lands. They translated Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Ptolemy, and many others into Arabic.
And they didn't just preserve this knowledge, they built upon it. Give us some examples.
Oh, there are so many. In medicine, you have Al-Razi, or Rhazes, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, whose medical encyclopedias became standard textbooks in Europe for centuries. In mathematics, scholars in India adopted the number system we use today, including the zero, and the Islamic world developed and transmitted it to the West, which is why we call them Arabic numerals. Algebra comes from the work of Al-Khwarizmi. In optics, Ibn al-Haytham conducted groundbreaking experiments, and the list goes on. Chemistry, astronomy, geography.
This was also a period of incredible economic and social sophistication. Islamic cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba had street lighting, public baths, hospitals, and libraries that dwarfed anything in Christendom. They created a vast trade network from West Africa to China.
And it's important to note the role of people of the book, Jews and Christians, in this civilization. As dhimmi, or protected peoples, they were allowed to practice their religion, run their own courts, and often rose to prominent positions as doctors, financiers, translators, and officials. This period was, for the most part, a golden age of coexistence compared to the tensions that would come later.
But no civilization remains at its peak forever. Internal divisions, new invasions, and the slow grind of history began to take their toll. The unified caliphate fragmented, and in the West, in the beautiful land of Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, we see both the height of this culture and the beginnings of its long decline.
Part 7. The Ornament of the World, Islamic Spain and Beyond. Islamic Spain, or Al-Andalus, is one of the most fascinating chapters in history. After the Umayyad dynasty was overthrown in Damascus, one prince, Abd al-Rahman, fled across North Africa and established a new Umayyad state in Cordoba in the 8th century.
And under his descendants, Cordoba became perhaps the most cultured city in Europe. At its height in the 10th century, it had 500,000 people, hundreds of mosques, public libraries, and street lighting. The Great Mosque of Cordoba, with its iconic red and white striped arches, is a masterpiece of architecture.
This was the period of the convivencia, the coexistence. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side, not always in perfect harmony, but in a society that produced an incredible cross-pollination of ideas. Jewish philosophers like Maimonides wrote in Arabic. Christian scholars from the north came to study in its libraries.
But this unity didn't last. The Caliphate of Cordoba collapsed in the early 11th century, breaking into smaller competing kingdoms called taifas. This political fragmentation made them vulnerable to the Christian kingdoms in the north, which began the long process of the Reconquista, the Reconquest.
And from the east came new, more zealous powers. The Almoravids and later the Almohads, Berber dynasties from North Africa, crossed over to reunify Al-Andalus, but they were often less tolerant than the Umayyads. Then, in the 13th century, the Christian victory at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa effectively sealed the fate of Islamic Spain, leaving only the small kingdom of Granada as a Muslim state for another 250 years.
And while this was happening in the West, the Islamic heartland in the East was struck by a catastrophe that would dwarf all others, the Mongol invasions.
In the 13th century, the Mongols, under Hulagu Khan, swept out of Central Asia. In 1258, they sacked Baghdad, destroyed its irrigation systems, burned its libraries, and killed the last Abbasid caliph. It was a blow from which the core of the Islamic world never fully recovered. The center of gravity for Islamic power and creativity began to shift to the periphery, to the Mamluks in Egypt, the Ottomans in Turkey, and the Mughals in India.
And throughout this entire period, weaving through the Christian and Muslim worlds was a third civilization, one without a state of its own, yet profoundly influential, the Jewish people. How did they survive and thrive in exile for so long? Part 8, The People of the Book, the Jewish Diaspora.
After the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 AD and the final suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD, the Jewish people were scattered across the Roman world and beyond. This is the diaspora. Their survival is a testament to the power of law, community, and text.
And the central text that bound them together, beyond the Hebrew Bible, was the Talmud.
Yes, the Talmud is a massive compendium of rabbinic discussions, debates, and legal rulings that form the basis of Jewish religious law, or halakha. It was compiled in both Babylon and Palestine between the 3rd and 6th centuries. It was, in effect, a portable homeland. No matter where a Jew lived, from Spain to Iraq, the Talmud provided a common legal and cultural framework.
And we see Jewish communities rising to incredible prominence in both the Islamic and Christian worlds. In the Islamic Caliphate, they were often merchants, doctors, and officials. In the early Middle Ages in Europe, they were sometimes the only literate non-clerical class, serving kings as financiers and diplomats.
But this prominence was always precarious. Their status as a non-majority religion made them vulnerable. In the Islamic world, periods of toleration under the Umayyads or in Al-Andalus were interspersed with periods of persecution under rulers like the Almohads. In Christian Europe, the Church's teaching of contempt, which blamed Jews for the death of Christ, created a deep-seated anti-Judaism that could flare into violence at any time, especially around the time of the Crusades.
And yet, in the midst of this adversity, Jewish thought and philosophy flourished. The greatest figure of this period was undoubtedly Moses Maimonides.
Maimonides was a rabbi, physician, and philosopher born in Cordoba in 1335. When the Almohads took over, his family had to flee, eventually settling in Egypt, where he became the Sultan's doctor. His two great works are the Mishneh Torah, a brilliant codification of all Jewish law, and the Guide for the Perplexed, a philosophical masterpiece that sought to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Jewish theology.
This was a huge deal, using the tools of Greek logic, which had been preserved by Muslims, to analyze and explain the faith of the Hebrew Bible.
Exactly. He was part of the same intellectual current that was affecting Christian scholasticism. And alongside this rationalist tradition, you had the growth of Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah, particularly in Provence and Spain, which offered a more esoteric spiritual path to knowing God. So Jewish civilization, even in exile, was dynamic, diverse, and deeply engaged with the intellectual currents of the age.
Now, let's return to Europe. For centuries, we've been calling this period after the fall of Rome the Dark Ages. But as we've seen, the light of civilization was still burning brightly in Byzantium, Baghdad, and Cordoba. What was happening in the heart of Western Europe during this time? Was it truly dark?
Part 9, Awakening from the Dark, the Resurgence of Europe. The term Dark Ages is increasingly rejected by historians. It was a period of transformation, not just darkness. Yes, it was a time of poverty, violence, and dislocation compared to the height of Rome, but it was also a time of slow, quiet rebuilding. The key figure in this process was a Frankish king crowned emperor on Christmas Day 800 AD, Charlemagne.
Charlemagne, king of the Franks, managed to unite most of Western Europe for the first time since the Romans, and in a symbolic act of immense importance, Pope Leo III crowned him Emperor of the Romans.
This event had two world-changing consequences. First, it created the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that would shape Central European history for 1,000 years. Second, it cemented the alliance between the papacy and the Frankish monarchy, a partnership between spiritual and temporal power that would define the Middle Ages. It was also a declaration of independence from the Byzantine Empire in the East. The West now had its own Roman emperor.
Charlemagne also sparked a cultural revival, the Carolingian Renaissance. He brought scholars from all over Europe to his court, like Alcuin of York, to standardize Latin, preserve classical texts, and improve literacy. This was the first conscious attempt to revive the culture of antiquity in the West.
But Charlemagne's empire didn't last long after his death. It was divided among his grandsons, and the 9th and 10th centuries saw a new wave of invasions. Vikings from the north, Magyars from the east, and Saracens, or Muslims, from the south. This led to the crystallization of the social system we call feudalism.
Explain feudalism. It's a term everyone has heard, but it's often misunderstood.
At its heart, feudalism was a decentralized system of government and society based on a hierarchy of personal bonds and land ownership. In a world without a strong central state to provide protection, a weak man would pledge his service and loyalty to a stronger man in exchange for protection and a grant of land, called a fief. This created a pyramid. At the bottom, serfs were tied to the land working for the local lord, the knights and lesser nobles pledged loyalty to greater nobles, and the greatest nobles pledged loyalty to the king.
It was a messy, localized, but highly effective system for providing security in a violent and unstable world. And at the top of this social pyramid, alongside the king, was the church. By the 11th century, the papacy was ready to flex its muscles and launch the most ambitious and controversial campaign of the Middle Ages, the Crusades.
Part 10. God Wills It, the Crusades and the Economic Revolution. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a council in Clermont, France, and gave an electrifying speech. He called on the knights of Europe to stop fighting each other and instead march to the east to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslim Turks, who, he claimed, were desecrating the holy places and persecuting Christian pilgrims. He promised the remission of sins for all who took up the cross. The crowd reportedly shouted back, Deus vult, God wills it.
The response was overwhelming. The First Crusade was launched. It was a brutal, bloody affair. Against all odds, the Crusaders succeeded in capturing Jerusalem in 1099, massacring its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants in a horrific slaughter. They established a string of Crusader states along the Levantine coast.
But why did the Pope really call the crusade? Was it purely a religious impulse?
The motives were always mixed.
There was genuine religious fervor, yes, but the Pope also saw it as a way to unite a fractious Christendom under papal leadership and to channel the violent energies of the knightly class away from Europe. For younger sons of nobles with no land to inherit, it was a chance for glory and wealth.
The Crusades were not a single event, but a series of them stretching over 2 centuries. Most were failures from a military standpoint. The Second Crusade fizzled out. The Third Crusade, with its famous leaders like Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, ended in a truce. The Fourth Crusade infamously never even reached the Holy Land, instead sacking the Christian city of Constantinople in 1204, a deep and lasting wound between the Eastern and Western churches.
So, if they ultimately failed in their goal of holding Jerusalem, what was their real impact? The impact was enormous, but not in the way the Crusaders intended. First, they dramatically increased trade between the East and West. Italian merchant cities like Venice and Genoa grew immensely wealthy, transporting Crusaders and supplying the outposts. This wealth would help fund the Italian Renaissance.
Second, Europeans were exposed to the superior goods, technology, and knowledge of the Islamic world. Everything from silk and sugar to advanced mathematics and medicine. This exposure created a demand for these luxuries and this knowledge back home.
And this leads us to the great silent revolution of the Middle Ages, the economic transformation. As trade grew, so did towns and cities. A new class emerged, the urban bourgeoisie, the burghers or townspeople who made their wealth from trade and manufacturing, not from land.
And with this new wealth came new institutions. Guilds were formed to regulate trades and train apprentices. Banking developed with Italian families like the Bardi and Peruzzi lending vast sums to kings and popes. A money economy began to replace the old barter economy of the feudal manner.
This is a crucial point. The rise of a cash economy began to undermine the feudal system itself. A serf could now sometimes earn money to buy their freedom. A king could tax trade and hire professional soldiers, making him less dependent on his feudal knights. The entire social order was shifting, and a prosperous, confident, and more secular urban culture was beginning to emerge. Part 11. Reason and Spires. Gothic art, universities, and science.
This new wealth and confidence expressed itself in one of the most visible legacies of the Middle Ages, the Gothic cathedral. In the 12th century, a new architectural style emerged in France, and it was a revolution in stone and light.
The key innovations were the pointed arch, the ribbed vault, and most importantly, the flying buttress. These external supports took the weight of the roof and allowed the walls to be filled with enormous stained glass windows. Walking into a cathedral like Chartres or Notre Dame de Paris was meant to be an overwhelming spiritual experience, a vision of the heavenly Jerusalem flooded with divine-colored light.
These cathedrals were community projects funded by guilds and townspeople, often taking over a century to build. They are the ultimate symbol of the age of faith, a society pouring its wealth, its art, and its very soul into the glorification of God.
But this same era also saw the birth of an institution dedicated to reason, the university. The first universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford began as guilds of students or masters, organized to regulate learning and grant licenses to teach.
And the curriculum was based on the 7 liberal arts, culminating in the study of theology, law, and medicine. But the real revolution came when the works of Aristotle, which had been preserved by the Islamic world, began to flood into Europe in Latin translation in the 12th and 13th centuries.
This created a crisis and an opportunity. Aristotle's logical, empirical, and rational view of the world, arrived at through human reason alone, was both dazzling and terrifying to Christian thinkers. How could you reconcile pagan philosophy with Christian revelation?
This gave rise to Scholasticism, the dominant intellectual method of the High Middle Ages. Its greatest practitioner was St. Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar. His Summa Theologica is a colossal attempt to synthesize faith and reason.
Aquinas' argument was brilliant. He said that faith and reason are 2 different paths to truth. And since all truth comes from God, they cannot ultimately conflict.
Reason can prove many things, like the existence of God, through his famous 5 ways. But some truths, like the Trinity, are mysteries that can only be known through faith and revelation. This marriage of Aristotle and Christian doctrine became the official philosophy of the Catholic Church.
So in the 13th century, you have these two powerful forces operating simultaneously: the mystical, transcendent faith of the Gothic cathedral and the rigorous, logical faith of the university. It was a period of incredible intellectual and artistic energy. And it was all setting the stage for the final glorious synthesis of the Middle Ages.
Part 12, The Summit and the Summation, Dante and the Medieval Legacy.
As we approach the end of our journey, we come to a figure who stands at the very peak of the Middle Ages and looks forward to the future, the Italian poet Dante Alighieri.
His epic poem, The Divine Comedy, is arguably the greatest literary work of the Middle Ages and the perfect summation of its world.
The comedy is an astonishing synthesis. It's a deeply personal story of Dante's journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise. It's a work of profound theology. It's a cutting political commentary on the Italy of his day, and it's a celebration of human reason, represented by his guide, the Roman poet Virgil, and divine love, represented by his ultimate guide, Beatrice.
The structure of the poem itself is a mirror of the medieval universe, ordered, hierarchical, and shot through with divine purpose. But Dante isn't just a passive observer. He judges the people he meets. Popes and emperors are placed in hell for their sins. This is a very human, almost rebellious act.
Exactly. Dante represents a new kind of individual consciousness. He uses the vernacular Italian, not scholarly Latin, to write his masterpiece, asserting the value of his own language and culture. He places classical pagan heroes in a noble part of hell. The comedy is the work of a man who has absorbed all the learning, faith, and art of his age and remade it into something uniquely his own. He is in many ways the first modern man and the last medieval one.
So, as the 14th century dawns, what is the final assessment of the Middle Ages, this age of faith? It was a period of immense contradiction. It gave us the sublime beauty of Gothic cathedrals and the horrors of the Inquisition. It produced the logical rigor of Scholasticism and the blind fury of the Crusades. It was an age of deep communal faith that also laid the groundwork for modern individualism.
Its legacy is all around us. Our universities, our legal systems, our languages, and much of our art and architecture are deeply rooted in the medieval world. The nation-states of Europe began to take shape in this period, and the great encounter and conflict between Christianity and Islam shaped geopolitics for centuries, echoes of which we still hear today.
Most importantly, the Renaissance did not appear out of a vacuum. It was not a sudden rejection of 1,000 years of darkness. It was the direct inheritor of the medieval world. The economic networks, the urban centers, the recovered classical texts, the universities, and the growing confidence in human reason, all of these were medieval achievements.
The humanists of the Renaissance looked back past the Middle Ages to the classical world, but they were standing on the shoulders of the monks, the scholastics, the guildsmen, and the poets of the Age of Faith. The modern world was not born in a sudden rebirth. It was forged in the long, slow, creative, and often painful fires of the Middle Ages.
And so we reach the end of our epic journey from the fall of Rome to the threshold of the Renaissance. We've seen civilizations rise and fall, faiths clash and coexist, and the human spirit persevere through chaos to create works of stunning beauty and profound thought.
The story of civilization is never a simple one. It's a complex tapestry woven with threads of faith and reason, war and peace, tradition and innovation. The Middle Ages teach us that no age is wholly dark, and no golden age is without its shadows. They remind us of the power of ideas to shape history and the enduring human capacity to build, to create, and to hope, even in the most challenging of times.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Age of Faith. In our next series, we'll dive into the thrilling story of the Renaissance and the Reformation, where the world we recognize as modern truly begins to take shape.
Until then, keep exploring the human legacy.
Don't forget, like, share, and subscribe. Bye-bye.